Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Cove podcast. I am Major Andrew Stokes, and today we're going to be talking about safeguarding Australia's military secrets. We're joined today by Mr. Peter West, the First Assistant Secretary, Defence Security. Peter has been a public servant in Defence for 27 and a half years. He's the Division Head of the Defence Security and the Chief Security Officer of the Department of Defence, responsible for overseeing the implementation of the SAMS legislation. Peter, thanks very much for joining us today.
Oh, it's a great pleasure to be here.
So the new Safeguarding Australia Military Secrets Law, or SAMS, protects Australia's military secrets and provides assurance to allies that we protect sensitive defence information and technology that is shared with Australia. Could you give us some background on what exactly SAMS is and what does it mean?
So SAMS is kind of what it says on the wrapper, Safeguarding Australia's Military Secrets. So we are very aware that in the current environment particularly, that foreign militaries and foreign nations would like more information on not only Australia's defence capability, but that of our allies as well. So the SAMS legislation is designed to ensure that we know where our military information is going, we know who it's going to, and we have an opportunity in some circumstances to intervene and prevent that information from being transmitted to parties or countries where we don't want it to go. And look, I'm sure in the current environment, most of your listeners would understand where those places we don't want that information to go are.
Absolutely. I think it's pretty self-evident, but why is this important?
I suppose most recently we've had a very public example of how foreign nations are trying to get our information. Only 3 weeks ago now, ASIO and AFP made an arrest of an Australian Defence Force member on charges of preparing for espionage. So it gives you an indication of how serious the security situation is and the lengths to which foreign nations will go to get our sensitive defence information. But the origins of SAMS go a fair bit further back than that. In fact, they go back to 2002, so around mid to late 2002. There was a series of media articles about pilots from Five Eyes countries who had been recruited to train Chinese military pilots. That really was highlighted in late 2002 when the British government admitted that a number of former Royal Air Force pilots had physically been training Chinese pilots in China, and some had been training Chinese pilots through third parties and companies outside of China. But that was a very public indication of something we know that's been going on for a long time, and that is countries have been using industry, education, training institutions to hire former defence personnel, both ADF and public servants, to tap into their knowledge and to obtain that knowledge and understanding of what Australia and our allies' defence capabilities can do.
Right, yeah, and like you said, it's a very timely example, completely unrelated to this podcast or the SAMS legislation, but a very timely example was just recently in the news. Yeah. So with that said, and you gave the example of fighter pilots, for instance, and people training possible foreign militaries overseas, who does this legislation apply to? Who is it relevant to?
Yep. So the legislation applies to two key groups of people. The first group is former defence personnel, and I use the word personnel very broadly because the legislation applies to Australian Defence Force personnel as well as Australian public servants who have worked for the Department of Defence or the Australian Submarine Agency, plus also a small group of people who have worked in ASD in the last 10 years. So that's the first group, so former defence personnel. The second group is the legislation applies to all Australian citizens who may be delivering training in relation to defence-controlled goods under what is called the Defence Strategic Goods List, or providing training in terms of military tactics, techniques and procedures. So the legislation applies to both of those groups, and it applies when people from either of those groups want to go and work for a foreign government, foreign military, or a foreign government-controlled entity. So that third one may sound a little complex, but that's just going back to that example I talked about earlier, where we know that some pilots were helping train China through third-party companies. So we're just ensuring that the legislation covers all those eventualities. It covers working directly for a foreign government or a foreign military, but also working indirectly for a foreign government or a foreign military through something like a company or even a charity or an training organisation.
Right. So the umbrella there is obviously quite wide, and there's no sort of loopholes by the sounds of it, especially for our audience being primarily defence members. It can be seen that they are 100% covered under this legislation. So with that in mind, for defence members specifically, what are the more practical implications of this legislation for them?
So, as you quite rightly pointed out, the purpose of the legislation was really to cover the waterfront, to make sure that all of the avenues that foreign organisations may be reaching out to former defence personnel were covered. But we're also very conscious that we don't want former defence personnel to be stopped from taking advantage of opportunities or jobs overseas. So the legislation is designed to be very broad and capture everybody. But once we've captured everybody, there's a number of exemptions under the legislation, which mean that you may be captured, but then you can immediately rule yourself out from needing to apply for what's called foreign work authorisation. So the key document under the new laws is this foreign work authorisation, or FWA, and that's just something that Defence gives to you, which says the work that you're planning to undertake is fine with us. So in addition to getting an FWA, as I indicated, a number of people are exempt from the legislation because they're doing work that we consider to be low risk. So the key group is anyone working for a Five Eyes country, so US, UK, Canada, New Zealand, are exempt under the Act. And then there are a number of exemptions that relate to the type of work that you did in defence. So if you did very sensitive work, for example, if you were in intelligence, we're very concerned about you working overseas. So there is a time frame attached to pretty much every job, or to every job family in defence, job, family and service category in defence. And so those time frames range from 1 year to 10 years. So as I say, if you're in a very sensitive job like intelligence or you're a pilot, it's likely that you will be covered by this legislation for 10 years. If you're in a less sensitive role like a chaplain, you'll likely only be covered by the legislation for 1 year. When you exceed that time frame, you no longer will require an FWA as an ex-Defence Force member.
Okay.
Just one last category I'll mention.
Yeah.
The third sort of exemption category is if you're working for the UN or as part of a humanitarian operation, you don't need to get a FWA either.
Okay. So you mentioned the FWA, the Foreign Work Authorisation. Can we just expand upon that a little? So in the lead up to the drafting and implementation of this legislation, what was the impact on defence industry and veterans? How was that taken into consideration, and how does that relate to the FWA?
Yeah, look, it's a very good question, and no one in your audience, I'm sure, will be surprised to hear that ministers asked us a lot of questions about what's the impact on veterans and industry going to be, and how can we manage that? Now, in developing the legislation, we did consult with a number of groups in both industry and the veterans community. So I think we got a good cross-section of feedback. And what we tried to do is calibrate the legislation so that we ensure that we cover off our highest risks, but we don't unduly burden either industry or individuals. So that's where all those exemptions that I was talking about come in. And we're constantly sort of looking at things like those timeframes I mentioned earlier about, are they reasonable? Can we reduce them further? And in some cases, we're looking at, can we exempt some certain service categories altogether in terms of potentially those people also not having to apply for an FWA. But the other thing we're very focused on is ensuring that we are able to process these FWA applications very quickly and ensure that the application process is as painless as possible. I know a lot of people, I'm sure listeners, think of defence bureaucracy of any type as being incredibly slow and painful. We have tried to ensure that's not what an FWA process feels like. So it is an online process. You go to the website, it's an online form. There's a lot of help and assistance in the form in terms of what you need to put in, and also giving you advice as to whether you actually need an FWA or not. So we are trying to minimise the impact on both former defence personnel, our veterans, and also industry by streamlining the process and making it as simple as possible, and I guess making ourselves available to people to answer questions. So we've been holding weekly information sessions since the 6th of May when this legislation launched, and we've held a number of sessions with both industry and veterans groups. So we're taking on board feedback and trying to make the process as efficient and streamlined as possible.
Great. I'm sure, as you said, a lot of people have experience with defence bureaucracy, so it is encouraging to hear that. Now, when we discuss military secrets, just to sort of bring this back down to the grassroots level, in popular media and the like, when we talk about secrets, we often think of things like secret weapon blueprints and nuclear launch codes. But what are some more mundane areas that people may not automatically think of, but are actually an issue under this SAMS legislation that they should be tracking?
Well, that's a really good question, and one I haven't been asked enough, I think. It's really one of the key drivers of the legislation was not so much the fact that we were worried about losing our top secret information or our secret information, because our protections around that are actually really very good. One of the main drivers of the SAMS legislation, that in defence, there is a lot of information that is lowly classified, or in some cases not even classified at all. It's just got markers on it. And the reason we do that is practical, because we need to be able to get this information out to training institutions. We need to be able to get it out to the front line. You can't have a defence force where every single bit of information is classified secret or top secret. But while we have very good espionage legislation protecting classified information, highly classified information, the protections we have for that more general information, which in many cases is still highly sensitive, was much more limited and much more difficult to, I guess, what you'd call getting a prosecution or a conviction if someone misused or mishandled that information. So SAMS was specifically designed to encompass that information, I guess very broadly, what you would call military tactics, techniques and procedures, because as much as foreign governments are interested in getting our most sensitive information, we also recognise the fact that many of our adversaries are just as interested in some of the basics we teach our Defence Force members and how to fight as modern Western armies fight. I mean, I think that we've seen a number of events around the world which show that some quite large foreign adversaries have not developed the military skills and capabilities to the same level that we have in the West. And that's not all highly classified information. Some of that's very basic information about our fundamental military tactics, techniques and procedures. So part of the legislation is deliberately designed to protect what may seem like very broad and simple knowledge to us here in Australia, but is actually highly sought after by our adversaries.
Okay, so that could potentially cover or does cover everything from official upwards from the sounds of it.
Well, yes, yeah. In fact, pretty much, as I say, the legislation is not designed around classification. So you don't need an FWA because of the classification of the information you had. The legislation is about, did you work in defence or not? Because that's our fundamental belief that if you have served in the Australian Defence Force for any period of time, you have been privileged and given insights to what I'd call is the Western way of war, or the way we do combined arms warfare in the West. And that's very useful information to our adversaries. So the legislation is very broad. It covers you whatever role you worked in defence.
Right. I think that's a really interesting point that, a lot of people in defence would probably think, well, I'm not sharing secrets that were given to me in a salmon-coloured folder with secret stamped on it. I'm just sort of sharing information that's just general as far as I'm concerned. This is just general knowledge like IMTs, but that actually, just by virtue of being a defence member, is covered under this legislation. That's quite interesting.
Yeah, and as I say, it's not necessarily to stop people sharing that, because there are many countries we're quite happy that this information is shared with. In fact, there are many countries around the world where we are, as a defence force, helping to lift their military capability, and we are quite happy if private industry also helps us in those endeavours. It's about ensuring, though, that we know who this information is going to, and making sure that it doesn't go to anyone who potentially will use it against us.
Absolutely. Okay. So with all that said, and you touched on, there's a website with obvious examples of how to seek approval. So let's say I'm a retired defence member and I want to work for a foreign organisation, such as a foreign military as a contractor or as for a company. What specifically do I need to be aware of in terms of processes I have to follow, and what do I need to do?
So the first step is go and look at the SAM's website, because it's quite a good website. It has a lot of information and should be helpful. And I even suggest, even if you don't know whether you need an FWA or not, load up and start processing an FWA form, because as I say, there's a lot of guidance built into the form itself about whether you might need one or not. But the really fundamental questions you need to ask yourself when accepting an overseas job is, who is the end beneficiary of this work? Now, is the end beneficiary a Five Eyes country? If so, you may not need an FWA at all. But if it's not a Five Eyes country, you probably need to go through the process of then checking, well, am I still covered by the legislation because of how long I've been out of my job in defence? And if the answer is, well, for example, if you only left 2 years ago, you're probably almost certainly covered. And if you're not working for a Five Eyes country, you're probably going to need an FWA. And so the two things you're going to need to focus on is, who are you working for? So is the entity that's employing you, if you're working for, say, a contractor, is that a foreign entity? So if it's not an Australian company, who actually owns that company? The easiest way to find that out is usually just to ask, but the threshold is usually, does a government own more than 50% of their stock in terms of controlling that company? And then who's the client that you're working for? So is the client a foreign military or a foreign government? Or even is the client another foreign controlled entity? Now, look, I know that sounds pretty complex, again, as we're talking about foreign entities, and it may sound difficult. How do I know? Where do I get the information? We have gone out to industry. Industry know about this. Usually the quickest way to answer some of these questions is, someone offers you a job, or is someone thinking about offering you a job, just ask them some basic questions like, are you a foreign-owned company, and who's the client that I'll be working for? And even then, again, your audience knows why we're doing this. It's personal to many of them, because they want to protect those who still remain in the Defence Force and they have worked with, and still feel an obligation to defence in Australia. And I think most of your audience has the common sense to understand which nations we are trying to prevent this information getting to. So if you're having a common sense approach to the jobs that you're thinking about accepting, I think you will find the FWA process to be very painless, relatively easy. You should get your FWA within about 2 to 3 weeks, and you'll never have to worry about it again. It'll run for 5 years before you have to worry about getting another FWA. But if you're thinking about working in what I would call a complex environment, it may take us a fair bit longer to assess that application.
So with all that said, let's say I'm that retired defence member that we were just discussing, and I've looked at this. It's all a bit complicated for me, even though, as we know, it's not.
Yep.
And I decide that I know better, and I choose deliberately not to comply with these requirements. Under this legislation, what am I looking at in terms of penalties?
Look, I would suggest not risking it because from 7th of August, the penalties under this Act come into effect. So working for an overseas government, military or foreign entity as an ex-Defence Force member without an FWA will carry up to 20 years imprisonment. Now, that may sound very steep, but that's actually the same penalty as foreign military offences under the Criminal Code. So if you go and fight for a foreign military, you could get up to 20 years imprisonment. And if you go and work for a foreign military, you could get up to 20 years imprisonment. So it's a very serious offence. Now, our goal is hopefully to make sure no one is ever caught up under this Act. My metric of success is 0 prosecutions under the SAMS Act. I want to ensure that every former ADF member knows about it and every former ADF member has no problems with applying for an FWA and getting an FWA if they want to work overseas.
Right. Well, speaking of which, you mentioned making sure everyone in the ADF is aware of it. We've been speaking about the individual so far, but in terms of disseminating that message, is there anything that leaders, supervisors, commanders, managers throughout the ADF and the department should be thinking about? So in terms of looking after their people, are there specific areas of defence that really should be paying special attention to this above others? Yeah, is there anything leaders should be doing to make sure that this legislation is disseminated and followed?
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. I think, look, one of the first things I'd suggest to every manager, ADF or APS, is go and find out what the job category that applies to you and your employees is, so that you can understand their obligations under the Act. So, as I said, those obligations range anywhere from 1 to 10 years, and every manager in defence should be doing an exit interview with anyone departing, and I know the ADF has their own exit process. Now, we're formally plugged into that as part of the exit documentation. You'll now be given some information about the SAMS and the SAMS Act's requirements, but it's obviously going to, I think, cut through more if you as a manager, as you're saying goodbye, farewelling people from either the Defence Force or the APS, you take the opportunity to remind them of what their obligations are, because more often than not, people are leaving us for a reason. They've got a job somewhere, and most of us know what that is, or at least know they're going to another job. So I encourage all managers to take the opportunity to understand the obligations and just remind people that as they leave, what their obligations are, because again, my goal is to ensure that no one unintentionally gets caught out on the wrong side of the SAMS Act.
So it's not just a matter of enforcement, but it's also a matter of caring for our people to make sure they're aware of these requirements and caught out.
And absolutely. The other part of the SAMS Act is that, it is to protect Australia, but in all honesty, an element of it is protecting our own people as well, because the way foreign governments go around recruiting ex-defence people across the Five Eyes is quite insidious. Like, very rarely will a foreign government come up and say, look, I'm from the embassy of so-and-so, we'd like to employ you to work for us. More often than not, it will be through a third party, it will be through a contractor or through contracting you directly. And we want to ensure that former defence people understand those risks, and when they apply, if we see some of those risks potentially manifesting themselves, it gives us an opportunity to reach out to those individuals and say, look, just be aware of the risks that you're potentially taking here. You might want to ask some more questions about this nature of employment, and you might want to just protect yourself a little more before proceeding in any further discussions with these people, well before we would either consider granting or denying an FWA.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, that it's not just about trying to capture people who are malicious, but rather that our people may actually be targets effectively.
Absolutely. Our people targets every day. And as I say, it is a very active, it is a very aggressive, and it is a growing foreign effort to recruit former defence people across the Five Eyes nations.
Mm-hmm. And as we said right at the start, very timely after what we've seen in the news just recently.
Yes. Don't
really
think it is not going to happen to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, before we wrap up, I just wanted to just reinforce the messaging here. You mentioned that the legislation comes into effect. I believe it was the 7th of August you mentioned?
Correct, yes.
7th of August for anyone who may be affected by this legislation or a team leader in their areas. It's really timely, as we've said, to disseminate this message and make sure those that are affected or potentially affected are on the SAM's website and looking at doing an FWA if required. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we conclude today, Peter?
Look, just a quick final plug for the website, defence.gov.au/SAMS. There's lots of information and resources on there. There is also an email address where you can just send questions that we're happy to answer. And as I say, don't feel intimidated by the process. It's pretty easy, straightforward. I suggest the simplest way to find out whether you need an FWA or not is to start an FWA form. And we will be as helpful and as flexible as we can in helping you get an FWA. We have an offline process in case your place of abode is somewhere without good internet reception. So we'll try and help in any way we can, and we'll try and make the process as painless as possible.
All right. And it's about being better safe than sorry, by the sounds of it.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. Great. Well, Peter, thank you very much for all of that information. Of great interest to my audience, the audience in the Cove, and the audience of Defence, both ADF and the Department of Defence. So I think it was really timely to have this episode today. So thank you very much for joining us.
Well, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you. This has been another episode of the Cove podcast. Thank you all for listening. Don't forget to find our content on the Cove website at cove.army.gov.au. And subscribe to the Cove on Facebook, X, LinkedIn, Instagram, and YouTube. And of course, download our app either on Google Play or iOS. Until next time, thank you for listening and goodbye.